about how ecosystems work. So we're looking at not just populations and how they interact with members of the same species. We talked about communities, how members of different species interact. Now we're going to combine in abiotic factors as well. So we're going to look at the interaction between the living things and the non-living things and what happens there. So again, remember that the definition of ecosystem is it includes the abiotic factors, air, wind, water, carbon dioxide, rocks, and all the living things, species, which make up populations, and then the interaction between different species, communities. We are looking at all of these things happening, these interactions in a specific area that makes an ecosystem. So a little bit about the ingredients within living things. Life requires some very specific things. One is that living things need energy to keep their processes going. We call that metabolism. Anytime you have an interaction of chemicals within a body, that's our metabolism, those chemical reactions when we're talking about living things. So a little bit about the difference between energy and nutrients. In our everyday lingo, we usually confuse the terms energy and nutrients, and we use them not quite correct. So if we're looking at something like this, we have an amino acid. Amino acids are the basis of proteins. Proteins that we know are really important for, you hear a lot about how much protein you have to get. People are on these high protein diets and things. Different diets focus on protein, but proteins make up some of the most really important things in our body. So amino acids and building blocks are really important. But we've got two things going on in this picture of an amino acid. In green, what I have circled are bonds. Bonds are the energy. So in green, the bonds are the energy, right? So I said energy fuels activities found in the bonds that hold together the atoms. The atoms are the nutrients. So the green is the energy and the blue are the nutrients. So within our food sources, we've got both energy and nutrients, but they're not the same thing. They're not, it's like sometimes we might say something about like, I have to get all my nutrients in for the day, and you're really referring to like energy and nutrients. And so just to know that within anything that we consume or use in our metabolism to fuel our systems within our cells, we're talking about the utilization or breaking. Anytime you break a bond, you release energy to a system. And then what you have left over are the atoms. The atoms are used to help build up things or break down things, and we release atoms in a variety of ways, like we breathe and we give out carbon dioxide. We take in oxygen, or we might sweat and release water. Or we have feces and urine, and they release a variety of different kinds of energy and nutrients. The chemicals, the building blocks, the atoms are the nutrients. The bonds hold the nutrients together. Not completely on the earth, but most of the energy that's utilized on the earth comes from the sun. We call this the process of photosynthesis, making that energy and nutrients, making those energy and nutrients available to others in the ecosystem. There's also, like, for example, chemiosynthesis, where other chemicals other than energy from the sun are used to fuel ecosystems. So for example, deep down in the ocean, if we go down thousands of feet into the ocean, there's areas that are called hydrothermal vents. And in these areas where there are hydrothermal vents, sunlight does not penetrate. Sun doesn't actually penetrate or go very far into the ocean. And so once you get down, let's say 100 feet, it can get pretty dark down there. And once you go further, let's say you go 1,000 feet, you're definitely not getting any sunlight energy down there. So you have ecosystems that thrive if you've ever seen a video of a hydrothermal vet, there's all kinds of like crazy worms and shrimp and crabs and octopuses and what's the basis of that? Well, the nutrients that come out of the core of the earth, they are often very toxic, very hot. Those are utilized in a process called chemiosynthesis. So for the most part, we're thinking about like more so the earth, but there are these weirdly evolved ecosystems that rely on energy from chemicals rather than sunlight. And chemicals are obtained as nutrients. We're going to talk about how and why and where and all of that throughout lecture today. Energy only moves one way. Once you break a bond and release that energy, it is utilized or it's lost to the universe. Energy goes down. As we use it, the amount of usable energy decreases. That's the second law of thermodynamics. The laws of thermodynamics state in the first law that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it can be changed from one form into another. That's the first law of thermodynamics. So we know that from like sunlight, energy is taken into a plant, goes through all of these processes within photosynthesis, and it gets changed and changed and changed. And ultimately, what you end up with are chemicals that help those plants to build themselves up and then also make some of that energy available as food. The second law of thermodynamics says that the amount of usable energy is always decreasing because some of it gets used by organisms, but also the big thing about the second law of thermodynamics is that when energy is converted from one thing into another, when you break bonds, the majority of that energy is lost as heat. So, you smart people here, if you can sit down and figure out how to capture that heat that's lost in the breaking of bonds, changing energy from one form to the other, you'll be like a bazillionaire, because that's a renewable form of energy. As energy keeps getting, it's always getting changed. But the majority of the energy in living systems, it's about 90% is lost as heat at every step. 90% lost. So there's a lot to grab onto there. So figure that out. There's some people who've been working on things in like the automotive world or the energy world where they can capture a little bit of that energy in a big system and it like lights up a light bulb for 3 seconds. But we're talking about a big system and a light bulb lighting up for 3 seconds. So they're on the right track, but that doesn't really equate to anything really useful in our society. So figure it out. Figure it out. Heat, heat, heat. Us, because we are what we call endotherms, endotherms take that energy lost as heat and we can capture a bit of it and we can use it inside of our body to make our body temperature regulated, and we stay at a pretty level body temperature. So our bodies have figured out a little bit of how to utilize that heat that's given off to benefit us so that unlike an ectotherm, like reptiles, they just, when they lose heat in the changing of energy from one form to the other within their metabolism or the chemical processes within their body, it goes out of their body. They can't capture or hold on to it. So they're pretty cold all the time. And one of the characteristics of reptiles is that they have to sun themselves during the day. That during the day, they get up in the morning and the sun's out and they're like, oh, I'm cold. And they go and they lay out in the sun. They warm up their bodies with heat from the sun. At nighttime, they just like get into balls and maybe burrow or find somewhere that they can stay warm enough all night to survive. So very different than us, right? We can, like now I know a lot of you are cold. You're not gonna die from hypothermia, even though it's cold in this room. Your body will use a little bit more energy heating up your bodies to try and keep you at that 98 degrees. Energy goes down and down and down. Nutrients never leave the system. So you could have hydrogens and oxygens and carbon and phosphorus and potassium that are from dinosaurs within your body. Because those atoms are used and used and recycled and used and recycled and used. So like our bodies, really, you're part dinosaur, I'm sure. Just interesting to think about. So that's kind of the two lectures today, is that we're going to talk about energy and how energy moves in ecosystems, and then we'll talk about nutrients and what happens with the nutrients. And they're a little bit interwoven, because we know that energy and nutrients are together within the biomolecules, or the abiotic factors within our environment. So we look at both of them kind of together and kind of separate. So ultimately, I talked about this, ultimately energy comes from the sun on the earth. Energy hits the earth in a few different ways as light, heat, and electromagnetic waves. This so important process, photosynthesis, can take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight and go through many metabolic pathways or reactions to undergo photosynthesis. If you took Bio 111, you at least got a little snapshot of the process of photosynthesis, but even that was really streamlined. All of those little metabolic pathways, there's so much more to them. If you ever go on and take a biochemistry class, you'll be like, whoa, this is complicated. It's very complicated. It's not just like you put in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and then out comes food and oxygen. There's a lot going on in between. Okay, so there's a lot of arrows here. We've got two things in this picture that I want you to look at. And one is that we're going to take a look, well, there's a few things I should say. So heat, that as we go from, let's start with the producers up here. So the producers, we're going to get into these terms a little bit more. I like the term producer because they're the ones that produce energy for everybody else in the ecosystem through the process of photosynthesis. So here's a term that I think makes sense in biology. So you've got the producers, they're undergoing photosynthesis. You can see a lot of heat coming in as sunlight, but you're also losing heat in that process of photosynthesis as well, because at every step, because of the laws of thermodynamics, we lose energy as heat. So producers are going to do a few things with the process of photosynthesis. So let's think about tomato plants. If you grew tomato plants this summer, pretty easy thing to grow in your yard, those tomato plants are using the process of photosynthesis for two major things. One is to grow the plant itself, right? The green part of the plant. Do any of you eat the stem of the tomato plant and be like, this is food? No, we don't eat that part, right? But the plant grows and grows all summer. So they've got to take some of that energy from photosynthesis and use it to grow their own body. And then they make maybe let's say a fifth of what they've grown available to us as food and tomatoes. So when we're thinking about the photosynthesizers, they use a lot of that energy to grow themselves, and they use some of that energy to pass on as food. So you've got kind of two important things there, is both themselves and the food available. So some of that food is passed on to we'll talk about different trophic or feeding levels that we've got. Our primary consumers, I like that term consumer, they're consuming energy from somewhere other than the cells of their body. And then we have the food chains, food webs, where that gets eaten by, so that eats that, eats that. Well, they don't go that way. This is eating that. They're not really going on. They're getting broken down by them. So the arrows, so when you're taking a look at the arrows, what the arrows mean, so think about like a polar bear, a cheetah, a fox, a hawk, or that looks like a hyena, a fox, a hawk. All of these are what we would call our most ferocious predators, our top predators. Do you think that the bird is eating the polar bear? No, right? So what this arrow, when you have the bird, if the polar bear and the cheetah are eating the bird, the arrows point to where the energy flows. Right? So you've got this bird who's going to give its energy by getting eaten by the polar bear. So arrows point to how the energy flows. Maybe make a note of that. on this illustration. So that will make a little bit more sense as you kind of sit down and you look at these arrows. They're showing energy flowing from one system to the next, one to the next. So it's showing us solar energy and heat energy. You are seeing heat loss, heat loss, heat loss at all these different steps. One of the things I don't like about this illustration is these should be really big. The heat arrows should be big, like bigger than the sunlight arrow. Energy is stored in chemical bonds, so let's take a look at the red arrows. This is energy flow. Energy in the producers is flowing to the primary consumers. And there should be like a down here to here, that we have energy flows. When all of these things within what we would call the feeding or trophic levels die or have waste, their waste and what's left in their bodies after they die goes to the detritus feeders and the decomposers. So the last bits of energy of all these living things gets utilized here. Do the red arrows point back to the producers? From here, they go there, and even the producers that go there, and there, and there. But do any of these heat arrows go from like here? See the energy arrows? Energy arrows are all pointing eventually to the detritivores and decomposers. Do we have a red arrow that points from them back to the producers? No, because they utilize the last bits of energy. They get the last bits of it. But let's talk about nutrients now. So remember, nutrients, we're talking about atoms. That from the producers, energy and nutrients are going to the primary consumers, and then from what we would call secondary consumers to tertiary consumers, so consumer to consumer to consumer. Eventually, you do see both of these arrows, red and blue, going to the detritivores and the decomposers, but the red arrows stop here. The energy stops here. It gets less and less and less and less, and it's used up. But the nutrients, they break down and utilize all the energy, and they release those nutrients back into the soil, the air, which are then utilized again by the producers. So energy, this big idea here is energy ends here, but the nutrients go back to the beginning, back to the producers. Energy is used, nutrients are recycled. So the nutrients go round and round and round, are recycled. So you might want to write like all used up by the end, recycled by the end. The energy is used, the nutrients are recycled. Used, recycled, used, recycled. Big idea. See, there's a lot in this illustration, isn't there? Yeah. It's complicated. Ecosystems are very, very complicated, and we've been saying that all along. And for so many different reasons. There's so many factors that make ecosystems complicated. Okay, so let's get back into some of those terms that I went through really quick. So producers, I love this. They produce their own energy. Definition that makes sense. They utilize mostly photosynthesis, maybe chemiosynthesis. They make sugar. This always bugs me about biology textbooks. When you have that placeholder that you have carbon dioxide and water and sunlight make sugar, C6H12O6, and oxygen, what happens with the sugar is the sugars go into a variety of metabolic pathways, and then they become different forms of food. That these metabolic pathways can then produce complex carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids, all the food sources that we eat. So all of those arrows mean that the sugar can go off into a lot of metabolic pathways from the end of photosynthesis and then create grains and fats, like in animals, or like avocados, for example, right? Fat in avocados, coconuts. Grains have a little bit of fat to them. All your fruits, all your veggies. We get a variety of proteins within, like grains have good sources of proteins. Your legumes, all of your beans, lentils, peas. So we get a lot of different foods from the sugar by continuing metabolic pathways within those producers. That's one thing that always bothers me about textbooks when they just say, make sugar and oxygen. Well, then what's next? Like, let's make the connection to what's really happening, is that ends up making all the other things. Because we know that in our tomato plant that we're growing, that the tomato isn't just like a cube of sugar. It's a whole bunch of other nutrients and molecules that are not C6H12O6. So you've got to have some metabolism happening to make those complex carbohydrates. So just big picture about photosynthesis. That going in, you could see three major arrows: water from soil, carbon dioxide from the air, sunlight energy. The three of these go into this long metabolic pathway that is photosynthesis, which then has other metabolic pathways used to grow the plant itself, but also to make our food. So I would say plant tissue growth and our food, and then oxygen is released. We also know that within, like down here, you've got the detritivores and the decomposers who are taking dead things and the waste of things, and they're making not just water and soil available, but they're making other minerals and nutrients, because like, how do you get from the process of photosynthesis, which is just putting in terms of like H2O and CO2, how do you make lycopene out of that for your tomato? Well, you couldn't. So you've got to have other nutrients that are absorbed along with the water into the plant. So the process is like, again, a lot of these like general classes, there's so much on the surface that, there's so much under the surface, I should say, that's happening. All right, so who undergoes photosynthesis? We've got plants, algae, cyanobacteria. We've got these three different groups that undergo photosynthesis. So we call them producers, but we also refer to them as autotroph. Auto means self. Troph means feeder. So it doesn't mean like you and I who can feed ourselves. They're feeding themselves within their cells through the metabolic processes of photosynthesis. So within their cells, they can fuel their energy needs. So autotroph, self-feeding, or creating the energy within their cells. Using this complex process of photosynthesis to build themselves up and then make food available to the rest of the ecosystem. Consumers, they consume outside of their cells. They have to get their energy sources from outside of their cells. Some of them consume, most organisms consume plants. So even if you're talking about like apex predators, the top predators, like bears and sharks and wolves, they're probably still eating some plants. There are some animals, like cats, for example. Cats are what we call hypercarnivores, that they're like pretty much only eating meat. They don't eat, they really don't eat many plants or plant matter. We also call these consumers heterotrophs. Hetero comes up a lot in biology. It means other. Troph means feeder. So that means they have to get their food and energy, their nutrients and energy from somewhere other than their own cells, other than their own bodies or cells. So a little bit about primary productivity. I talked a bit about this. Primary productivity, when we look at that in an ecosystem, it means how much energy can the producers supply to the entire ecosystem. So how much energy are they capturing? But didn't we say that that energy isn't completely passed on as food, that they have to build up their own bodies? So we look at something a little bit different than primary productivity. We also look at net productivity. Oh, I'm not gonna get there yet, but eventually I get there. Net productivity, I know I talk about it somewhere in this lecture. Net productivity means that you subtract the energy they use to build their own bodies up, and then what's left over is available to the ecosystem. So we look at that primary, what they can bring in, but then they use a lot for themselves. A lot gets lost as heat in the conversion of food, and then what's left over, that's net primary productivity. Oh, I do have it in the next slide. I went too fast, sorry. Whatever is left over for everybody else in the community, that's what we call net primary productivity. All right, back to a little bit about primary productivity. Primary productivity depends on a bunch of things, like how many nutrients are available. So if you have an area that has great drought, it's very, very dry, the other nutrients, the other atoms that usually will be taken in with the flow of water through the roots of the plant, they're not available because they're dry. They don't have anywhere to flow into the plants. So nutrient availability can really be dependent also on the amount of water availability. So these often will go together. Of course, sunlight, we know that's really, really important to productivity, but this can be affected by this. Nutrient availability also can depend on, like, for example, let's say Maui, that some of those areas in Maui that burned, they had pineapple plantations, and what they did was they took diverse areas that had a lot of different kinds of species in an ecosystem, and they cleared them out, and then they planted pineapples. The nutrients that the pineapples produce and then keep putting back into the ground from dying, it's not the same as when you have a variety of organisms and all the different nutrients that they can be making available to the detritivores and decomposers. So we can also limit that based on a lot of times like what happens with the interaction of humans and how we change our land for our own personal uses to look at what we call monoculture, focusing on like one specific species in an area by getting rid of everything else. So getting rid of everything to grow pineapples or corn or soybeans. And then the last thing is the temperature. You see a correlation between these two, that usually where you have warmer temperatures, there's more sunlight. Where there's more temperature, higher temperatures, water precipitates and evaporates, it goes up and down. So you have, and then also like, then that has an effect on that. So we have a lot of these that their interactions are very commingled. All right, so yeah, blah, 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 what these numbers mean. But what I just want you to look at is that the numbers themselves, which ecosystems have the highest numbers, mean they're more productive ecosystems because they reflect all four of these. Okay, so the higher they are, the more they reflect all of those different parts of what's needed for primary productivity. So our highest number I see is the tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforests are near the equator. They're tilted toward the sun all year, so they get an ample amount of sunlight or a maximum amount of sunlight. Because they have a lot of sunlight, they have warm temperatures, they have water that comes up and down, and there's a great diversity of species, and so you get a lot of that recycling of nutrients through the detritivores and the decomposers. So they've got a lot going on here. Let's look. Our second highest are estuaries that are often near the shorelines or just off of like land that has diverse ecosystems, usually warmer, sunnier, higher temperature areas with lots of nutrients and diversity of life. And then we have, so temperate deciduous forests, we've got that right here. Have any of you been hiking in a rainforest? Well, if you've seen pictures of a rainforest, if I just showed you rainforest and deciduous forest, you might not know the difference by just looking at them unless I said, well, that's actually a picture from our forest preserve, and this is a picture from Belize. And just looking at the pictures, you'd be like, well, they look really similar. They're like big trees and they're green. The one downfall here is that we have seasons in our area of the world. So that we have that winter that locks up water, we get lower temperatures, we get less sunlight, and we get less of that recycling of the nutrients over that time. But we still have a pretty high number here. It's the third highest of these ecosystems up here. So if we didn't have seasons, if we didn't have that kind of tilting of the earth in a different way that led us away from the sun, we would rival tropical rainforests with diversity of species and also our productivity number. So interesting to think about. And then you can see the other ones go down. Desert, for example, tons of sunlight. Tons and tons of sunlight, warm temperatures. But not much water. Because they don't have much water, there's not the ability of nutrient flow to support. Nutrient flow would come from a diversity of species. Water is so important to living things because at the core of it, we've got three principles that water really fuels. One is photosynthesis. The other two are the making of molecules and the breaking of molecules. Dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. So we need water too for all living things to go around and round. So you could have a ton of heat and sunlight, but if you don't have water, you're not going to have a diversity of species, and your productivity numbers are going to be very, very low. So another one that's interesting to think about. We put our food systems into what's called a pyramid of energy. You may have seen one of these pyramids. We put trophic levels on our pyramid of energy. Remember we said autotroph and heterotroph. So there's that troph, which means feeding. Autotrophs within the pyramid of energy can make their energy within their own cells, and heterotrophs have to get their energy outside. So we're back to some similar terms here. So just remember those terms, and when you see them, be like, oh, I know what that means. That means feeding, so there's something going on here. So I'm going to give you these. The first trophic lever, primary, I'm going to put it on the board. I'm going to make a pyramid of energy here for you. So we have this big pyramid, and we're going to divide our pyramid into levels. Our bottom level are the primary producers. So remember, we're talking about autotrophs. And our three groups of our photosynthesizers are plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. It's our biggest step here on our pyramid. It's quite large, which should also give you the idea that we have the most of these in the ecosystem. That if they're primarily producing the energy within the ecosystem, we need a lot of them, because as energy gets converted from one form to another, a lot of that energy goes as heat, and then they have to make some available to the next level. The next level are the primary consumers. Because they're getting their energy from somewhere other than the cells of their body, we call them heterotrophs. They're what we would call an herbivore. In human terms, we would call that a vegetarian or vegan, that they're only consuming primary producers. So energy is flowing up to them, right? We're going to put our arrows in the way that energy flows from one level to the next. So the primary producer energy is flowing up to them. And then we have the third trophic level and a fourth trophic level, and in ecosystems you might have a fifth and a sixth, and so we're just going to look at 4 to make this somewhat simple. Our third trophic level are called our secondary consumers. They are heterotrophs also. They get their food from outside of their cells. These include omnivores. Omni means many. They consume many different kinds of food or many different levels. Primary can be noted as a 1 with a little like circle on top. So we could have our 1 little circle producers and our primary consumers also. Secondary could be like this. Secondary. If you wanted to do shorthand, just so you know, if you ever see that somewhere, I'd like you to know. And then you've got your top. And again, you could have a lot more levels, like you could have secondary, tertiary, quaternary, and you could keep going up and have a lot of these consumer levels in here, but we're going to make it simple. We're going to call these the apex predators. Oh, sorry, let me also add in arrows. They are eating them or getting energy from them. I made that the wrong color. I should have said to make my coloring right. And they're getting energy from them. Colors are good to have right. Okay, apex predator, top. Apex means top. The apex predators, top predators, are a combination of omnivores and primary carnivores. Carnivores means that they only eat meat. So we call these omnivores and hypercarnivores, or primary carnivores, or we might just say carnivores. So the omnivores, they're going to get some of that energy from our primary producers. But they're also going to get energy from our primary consumers, and so are they. And then they're going to get from them as well. So you can see the energy's flowing up and up and up and up and up. Remember, at every level, you have the loss of heat. So that we're always losing heat as we have those conversions as well. So here my heat loss arrows, you can see, are quite large in comparison to the amount of, or the size of the arrows of the energy that's passed on. Because we lose a lot of energy as heat. So often we see these kind of things in textbooks where they just show a few different kinds of primary producers, only one kind of primary consumer, only one kind of secondary consumer, and one kind of tertiary consumer. Is this really, even if we were talking about out there, for example, would this be descriptive of our ecosystem in whole? No, there's way more diversity at every level, right? So oftentimes what we'll call this a food chain. That eats that, eats that, eats that, or energy flows that way. So a lot of times these trophic pyramids are not very descriptive, just to point out. Let's take a look at this question. So if a wolf eats a rodent that ate a smaller insect that ate a plant, the wolf would be which one? Would it be an autotroph, a primary producer, a primary consumer, a secondary consumer, a tertiary consumer? You can stick them, each of the species, into one of these and see where you end up. Yeah, so what you know is that you've got the plant is the primary producer, you've got the insect is the primary consumer, the rodent, secondary consumer, and then you end up with the wolf as the tertiary consumer. No, going that way. This is this one's a little more descriptive, that at least when you're looking at this illustration here, it does show a variety of primary producers and a variety of primary consumers, but then it shows one species of fish and one shark. So it's, at least this is a little descriptive, and again, this is not very descriptive. But what you see are what we would call chains of the flow of energy. So energy flow, in general, when we're looking at a textbook, usually doesn't even acknowledge omnivores, right? It's just showing, here at least I showed you that the secondary consumers are getting some energy from the primary producers and the primary consumers. Most of the time, we don't show that. What's more descriptive is what we call a food web. That there's a lot of overlap of what different species eat, but it's not exactly the same for every species, so it becomes this kind of messy little web. So this is a bit more descriptive, but even this leaves out a lot. Let's just look at the mouse, for example. That you have this mouse here, and there's an arrow pointing to an owl, to a badger, to a hawk, to a wolf, and to a snake. And remember, that doesn't mean that this eats that. It means that energy flows from this to that. The mouse is having some arrows pointed from this grass here to it, but that's it. So we do have some of this like overlap of arrows that shows that you have a diversity of eating strategies or feeding strategies for different species. Okay, so a lot of times people say, well, the base of the food web are the primary producers, but would the primary producers exist without the detritivores and the decomposers? So I always like to look at and think about, there's another level that we don't even address here. And they exist outside the trophic pyramids, and I would call these then the decomposers and detritivores. I'll call these the D&D and the D&Ds. And you also have energy flowing out that way. It's complex. Not as easy as just like one little textbook illustration. There's a lot going on. So the detritivores and the decomposers, they're going to get all of the waste and dead things of everybody within the pyramid. And in getting the waste and the dead things, they're going to break apart any last bonds of energy, and then they're going to make the nutrients, the atoms, available to the rest of the ecosystem. So without these and their nutrients, you couldn't have these, to have these. All right, so a little bit about them. The detritivores, they consume leaves over the fall. They're going to be working on all the leaves that fall from our trees in our area, dead things, waste, anything else out of bounds of that. We see a lot of turkey vultures. They circle the forest preserves all the time. You look in the sky, you'll see them. They're trying to eat up anything that's dead out there, thankfully. Other scavengers, earthworms, millipedes, insects, other worms, they're going to eat the stuff that thankfully they eat, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to walk out our doors. There'd just be dead stuff and waste everywhere. Remember, they're going to take any energy in the bonds. They're going to grab up that last bit of energy. So one thing about ecosystems is energy does not go to waste. Something's going to use it. Well, what happens when they die? When they die, you have the decomposers. So like beetles. Beetles probably detritivore. Decomposers, the bacteria and fungi. Not all fungi, but some fungi. And not all bacteria, but some bacteria. And then they're going to also they're going to take the last bits of energy of the dead detritivores. They're also going to break down waste and dead things as well, other dead things. And then they make those nutrients available. So bacteria, fungi. Fungi do something a little different. They excrete their enzymes outside of their bodies onto the thing that they're trying to consume. I don't say eat, but consume is a good word. So their digestion happens outside, and do you want me to go? Yeah. Yeah, anytime ask, because I know I can go fast. Yeah, good.
Because there's 2 blanks, but it's only a 1 line.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, simple nutrients.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Sometimes I make changes in one place and not in the other. Sorry.
Can you do the last bullet points? The one with fungi and
Yeah. There you go. All right, without decomposers and detritivores in an ecosystem, plants would eventually die, plants would soon develop nutrient deficiencies, dead material would accumulate, the soil quality would get poorer, or all of these. Yeah, good. Remember, when you're looking at questions, you don't just stop at the first one and be like, yep, that's it. But what if this is an answer? So read them all.
I have a question.
Yes?
So during the exams, would the questions be similar to these?
Yeah. That's why I put them in, give you a little taste. Energy transfers, we said, is inefficient. So one, we said the loss of energy is heat, right? Laws of thermodynamics. Somebody figure it out. Okay, heat. Also, energy gets lost or utilized in primary productivity that those producers have to build themselves up and then make some of what they produce available to the rest of the ecosystem. A lot of plants have cellulose that is really, it's a very, very, very complex carbohydrate. So there's a lot of bonds, and not only the bonds go this way, but then they go this way. And there's a lot of bonds between the simple sugars that make up cellulose. It makes it hard to digest. So that's what we call fiber in our diets, is that fiber, our body works really hard physically through peristalsis, but chemically. And that's why we have long digestive systems, because we should be eating a lot of cellulose. There's a lot to be thought about there in terms of your diet. I'll talk about that when we get to digestion. Consumers use energy, but they don't use all the energy. They die too, right? At every level, you have death. So we have a lot of reasons why we need a lot of producers in the ecosystem. This is, again, a little similar to what I did there. The arrows are a bit more descriptive. I do wish that the heat arrows were even bigger. But one thing that I want you to pay attention to is through the trophic pyramid, look at the size of the arrow from here to here and here to there, but then look at the amount that the decomposers and the detritivores are getting. But compare these two. The death of these are passing on more energy to the D&Ds as opposed to passing it through the trophic levels. So they're really getting the majority of the energy in our ecosystems, and we don't even see that. And the heat arrows should be big, big, big. So 10% efficient in natural ecosystems approximately. So if it's 10% efficient, it's 90% inefficient. If I put a question like this on the exam, a lot of times students don't read it clearly and then they go, oh, it's only 10% inefficient. I said inefficient. 90% inefficient, 10% efficient. So make sure you're reading clearly. 10 to 10 to 10 to 10 to 10 to 10, 10% law. So 10%, 10%, and 10%, and 10%. You don't get a lot passing through. So if we look at these numbers and we take that 10% and 10% and 10%, you get up to apex predators, and here we're looking at like quaternary, so we added another level beyond what I added here, that of the original energy that the producers have brought into the ecosystem, they're only getting 0.01%. That's teeny. And then here's just another way to look at it. If we looked at it with calories, let's say they bring in 1,000 calories, the next level's only getting 100 of those 1,000, 10 of those 1,000, 1 of the original 1,000. So that's why you've got to have so many producers in an ecosystem, because you've got to have a lot of that. Let's bring stuff in. It's also why there's less predators up at the top. They have to work really hard to get their food. and in general, just balance in an ecosystem is important, because if we had more predators, how would they be fed if there were more predators than there were producers? There would be no good balance in there as well. Here's a double whammy: toxic substances, which we see a lot more of an effect today because of humans than we ever have before. Toxic substances have enormous effects on ecosystem health. So what we call this process, when toxic substances are passed along with the food, pass through the decomposers and the detritivores and cycle around and around, is we call this the biological magnification or amplification of these toxic substances, which should give you the idea that, let's say that they're taking in water from an area around a plant that makes Care Bears, and there's a lot of toxins that are released from the air and the water, and they get some of those toxic chemicals from that factory. Some of that's in the body of what they feed that goes into them. The number of these that they eat is a lot more, so they're getting a lot of toxic substances up here, a lot more than they did. They eat them and them. So here's the thing here, is that, let's say these two, what they're getting is not only the toxic substances within their bodies, but you also have to consider that something here got all the toxic substances of them and them. So it gets bigger and magnifies as you go up. I always hate this negative stuff, right? Because it gets you thinking about, makes me so mad that our legislators are not protecting us appropriately. All right, so how do they do that? Sorry. Toxic substances, like, for example, like DDT was used a long time ago. In some areas of the world, it's still used. It has high amounts of chlorine. Chlorine, the atom chlorine, it has a stability factor. So when things attach to it, it makes that whole molecule harder to break down. So it gives us a space that allows it to persist. Pass on, pass on, pass on, pass on, pass on. Get reabsorbed again, pass through, reabsorb, reabsorb. And so instead of like just getting broken down, like energy, how it's getting less and less and less, when you have something like DDT that's sprayed around them, it comes back, and then they get the old DDT plus the new DDT. And then they get more and more and more. And so we have another magnification factor there. But why would they want to do that? Why would they want to take toxins and make them stable? Well, because then we have to use less in the future. But we still keep making Care Bears because everybody wants them. They're so cute, right? So then we just make more and more and more and more. If a toxin is made in a way that it is biodegradable, bio, there's that word, means living things. Degrade means to break down. So let's look at the word. Biodegradable means able to be broken down by a living thing. So what if we didn't use chlorine and maybe like some weed protection around here, or around, let's say, our corn and soybeans in our area? If we use something that could be biodegradable but still eliminate other kinds of like weeds, then it would get broken down by the living things, and it wouldn't then persist over and over again. But why don't we do that then? Well, the way our system is done, there's so much corruption that the producer of the toxic chemical gives money to our legislator, and then our legislator says, oh, we can still use that. It's fine. It's not proven to be linked to cancer. And then they're giving money. People are just shuffling money all over within our society to say, I'm going to give you money to say that there's no linkage, even though you might know there's linkage. And I'm going to give you money that says, like, I know you're producing this toxic thing, so I'm going to give the legislator money, so they just, it's corrupt. And that's a whole other class. These toxic chemicals get stored in our fat. So we've got in our fat in our bodies, we've got like all these chemicals that just like your body in the process of breaking down like your food, for example, if it has these chemicals all over it, your body's like when it breaks apart those bonds and it passes on the nutrients, it's like, I don't know what to do with this, so it stores it in your fat. That's why these quick detox things where you're like, I'm gonna go on this juice cleanse. The first couple days you feel like absolute crap because guess what? You're quickly losing water and fat and you're releasing all these chemicals very quickly back in your system and you're feeling like total crap. So don't do those. It's not. Is it healthy to do that? No. But nobody acknowledges this biomagnification and storage of chemicals in our fat, so you shouldn't do that. If you ever want to do a cleanse, what you should do is just start eating whole foods. You know the store Whole Foods? The reason why it has that name is because the foods are, you're eating them whole. They're not chemically processed. So the idea of a cleanse really should be to eat fruits and veggies and grains and nuts and seeds and beans. That's a cleanse. Much healthier for you. Plus, in juice diets, you're not getting fiber, and our body needs fiber. We'll talk a lot more about that too. So consumers, not only is the energy transfer inefficient, but also then you're getting that biological amplification of chemicals. So even this is kind of like double whammy thing that affects our ecosystems. And again, because we have more chemicals in our society, ecosystems are not getting the energy transfer well, and they're getting a very good transfer of chemicals. And we know a lot of chemicals are not regulated well, so we get them all. So some of you are like, I can't live without meat. I will never become a vegetarian or a vegan because I need my cheeseburgers and my this and that. The higher you are here, the more biomagnification affects you because you're eating, these are getting all the chemicals of them and them and them. So your magnification is much higher. That's another reason to give up meat. Plus, it's just not sustainable, and we'll talk about that next class, I think, too. Predatory birds may have 1 million times the concentration of a toxin that's found in the water, not even in the primary producer, but in the water. And so here's another reason why you get few and few top predators. But what if one of those top predators is a keystone species? It's going to disrupt the entire community structure without that particular predator. Like the sea stars, Robert Payne got rid of those sea stars. Or like wolves, what if the wolves are getting poisoned? We are not immune, and we are probably worse than anybody. Grab and go food that has toxic chemicals in it. Whole Foods. I don't mean you have to buy from Whole Foods. It's expensive. Go to Aldi. Much cheaper. So this should just give you a visual of if this is the amount of toxin in a water and blah, 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 whatever, parts per million. So let's say there's this amount of chemical in this area of size of water, and then you look at the primary producer, a primary consumer, and then that's only the secondary consumer. What about the tertiary and the quaternary? It'll be colored in by the next level. So more people, let's think about this too. More people can be fed with grains than if you're feeding a cow because you want to eat your cheeseburger. That let's say we have our whole nature study area. Let's say there's a zombie apocalypse and we are the last humans left. Would it be smart to use our whole prairie to feed one cow so that like in a few months we can all feast on a cow for like a couple weeks? Or would it be smarter to just grow a whole bunch of grains and veggies and fruits and things like that that can be grown over and over and over again and sustain us for a really long period of time? That one cow is going to eat all of our plants, and then we are like, eat the cow, and now we're going to